Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in June of 2025. And because of some vacation time, there were quite a few of them. So let's go ahead and dive in. I started the month by reading The Strange Case of Jane O by Karen Thompson Walker. And this is the story of a woman who has a kind of like amnesia, and she has a situation where she is, I think, in the hospital and is trying to figure out what happened. And I will say this book took a turn that I was not anticipating. That's kind of, well, I don't want to give anything away, but I will say that it is not a typical like mystery kind of thriller, which is what I thought it might be. It ends up actually being something more than that, which I thought was really interesting. I've read this author before and I liked her, so I like this book as well. Next, I read a trilogy by Kirsten Modglin. And this is one that I liked the premise of it, and I thought it was kind of interesting, and I had no idea where it was going to go. Basically, the first book, which is called The Arrangement, is about this husband and wife that decide to have, or try, basically an open marriage. And so they start to kind of date other people. And it quickly takes a turn for the worst. And it turns into this kind of like very twisty, cliffhangery, like mystery thriller. And the second book, which is called The Amendment, kind of continues the story. And then there's a third book in the series called The Atonement. And this was definitely a page turner. They're all relatively short. They ended, chapters ended off on cliffhangers, books ended on cliffhangers, and you just wanted to keep turning the pages. I think I read each of these back to back. And because my library had them on audio, I was just going through them super speedily. So that one was one that felt like a bit of like an airplane read. Like if you're looking for something where you can like quickly turn the pages and get like really immersed in the story, that was one that I would recommend. Then I read a book called The Man in the Window by John Cohen. This is a book that is kind of a literary novel about this man who hides himself away because of like a disfigurement. And then there's this woman who's a nurse, and they eventually kind of meet each other and form, kind of a relationship. What's interesting about this book is the way that it's described. You think that this happens, this meeting of this man and this woman, like relatively early in the book, and then it's kind of about this relationship unfolding. And actually that happens like relatively late in the book. And so you get all of these other like side characters and people within the community that you're learning about, and you get backstory on like what's happened with these two characters. But I felt like the description of the book wasn't entirely accurate as to like what you get when you dive in. So it was a little bit not what I expected. Beautifully written. I did enjoy the storyline, but I definitely would call this one literary fiction. It's not very plot driven. It's more character driven. Then I picked up a book called Hide by Tracy Clark. This is the first book in her series called the Detective Harriet Foster series, and it takes place in Chicago. I would say this is a really solid entry to a first book in a series. I would definitely continue on and read more. This is a book about a detective who's like trying to track down a serial killer, and it's set up really nicely in terms of like the backstory of the main character and some of the side characters, and you start to want to know kind of the history, and you want to know more about kind of like what is making these people tick, which I think is a really good starting point to a series where you're trying to kind of decide if you want to continue further and if you're like invested in the characters. Okay, then I read pretty much back to back a series by S.T. Abbey that has 5 books in it. They're all novellas, so they're relatively quick reads. I also had these on audio, and it's basically a series about a woman serial killer who starts to date a FBI agent. And of course, the FBI agent is tracking her, not realizing that she is the serial killer. So the first book in this series is called The Risk, and then the other books are Sidetracked, Scarlet Angel, All the Lies, and Paint It All Red. And throughout this series, which I would say, read the trigger warnings on this one, because there's a very traumatic event that kind of triggers this woman to be basically a serial killer who has a vendetta. She's trying to kill very specific people for very specific reasons. And the triggering point for that is, definitely a trigger warning for like sexual assault, if that's something that you want to look more into before you pick up this series. The thing that I found, obviously the most interesting was the back and forth between her and this male love interest, the FBI agent. And the kind of concern she has that eventually, he's going to figure out that she is a serial killer. And as somebody who tracks serial killers, he will not be able to be with her anymore. And she, is genuinely, falling for this guy. And so you see their relationship kind of deepening over time. Very satisfying ending to this series. This was another one that I pretty much read back to back because it's just really compelling. And there are cliffhangers at the end of each of these like novellas as well. And because they're so short, it was super easy to read them, very quickly. Also this month, I read the 3 main books in the Hunger Games series, and then also 2 additional books that had been added to the series as prequels. So before I read the prequel books, I wanted to go back and reread the original trilogy. So that includes the Hunger Games, Catching Fire, and Mockingjay, which have all been made into films. If you're interested in kind of checking out the books or checking out the films, this is a YA dystopian series about several districts that compete against each other in something called the Hunger Games, where multiple kids basically are put up as tribute. And there's a boy and a girl from each district, and they go into what has been designed by like a game designer, a very dangerous setting, and they have to basically kill each other, and whoever wins is the person who survives. Pretty bleak when you hear it described that way. This is a trilogy of books that I think has been beloved by many people. And so the 4th book, which is called The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, is the story of President Snow, who is kind of seen as a villain across this trilogy. And then the 5th book, which just came out, is called Sunrise on the Reaping. And this is the story of, each of the tribute teams has a mentor. And Sunrise on the Reaping is the story of the mentor of the original tribute team from the Hunger Games. And so his name is Haymitch, and you get to go back and kind of hear his story because he was originally in the Hunger Games for his district years and years and years ago. And that's how he becomes a mentor for them. So it takes you all the way back and kind of explores his story. I will say that I think some people are just in love with this trilogy. It had, I think, a nostalgic moment for a lot of people who read this, at a certain age. I was not necessarily one of those people, but I think these are great stories. I think they're well done. I think it was really fun to kind of revisit the world of the Hunger Games by reading these 2 prequels and kind of seeing what the author was adding in. So would recommend those as well. All right, next up, I read a book called Appetite for Innocence by Lucinda Berry. And I've been kind of going through Lucinda Berry's backlist. She has different premises for her books that I find really interesting. This particular book is about a serial killer who targets teenage girls. And there's a teenage girl who basically escapes, and she allows for other people to escape, the situation as well. And one of the other girls who escapes this serial killer, there's some question as to, she has a little bit of like a Stockholm syndrome, because she's been with this person for a long time. And so there's kind of this aftermath story of their escape, and they're still trying to catch, this person. And one of the girls is kind of suspect because of how she's acting and how she had kind of a long-term relationship with this person because of the time frame in which he kidnapped her and kind of held her captive. Lucinda Berry, I would say, is again another kind of airplane read, kind of author. These are typically relatively quick-paced stories. They're compelling in terms of the plot. They're more plot-driven, I would say, than character-driven. And so there's a bunch of different stuff I've read by her. And this is not necessarily the favorite one that I read, but I found it pretty interesting. Then I picked up a book called The Microstress Effect. This is by Rob Cross, and I believe there's a second author here. Rob Cross and Karen Dillon. And this is basically a book about how little small stresses throughout your day, typically at work, but also in your personal life, can create what is called the microstress effect, which is basically they add up and they kind of culminate over time. And so this is a book that's basically talking about all the different ways that you can try to not experience those micro stresses so that you can have a better life. This is actually something I had read about in Harvard Business Review. They had an article, I don't know, maybe 18 months ago, and I was interested in the topic, and then I saw that they had a full book. So I'm glad that I picked that one up. Then I picked up a book called All Superheroes Need PR by Elizabeth Stevens. This book was such a pleasant surprise to me. It is basically about these different superheroes. Some of them are villains, some of them are heroes. And one of them from the villain side decides that he wants to come over to the hero side. And so he needs a public relations specialist to kind of help him do that. And he basically falls for this public relations specialist. And this book was so fun. There were so many cool twists and turns. It was so fun to see this villain kind of like trying to come over to, the better side, and all the things that he does, to kind of prove himself. And of course, their relationship kind of deepens over time. This was a really fun one. And I think if it's a series, I would definitely pick up the next one. Then I picked up a book by Alan Halad called The Long Flight Home. This is a book about homing pigeons and how they were used, I believe, in World War II. Let me make sure that I'm getting that right. Yes, 1940. And basically, there's this kind of a relationship between this man and this woman is raising these homing pigeons. And there's all of this kind of like turmoil. Obviously, they're in the middle of the war, but they're trying to kind of like navigate through it. And this is one of those books that I would say has more depth, in terms of the characters. It's definitely historical fiction. If you're interested in historical fiction, I did enjoy this one. It was a little bit slower paced, than obviously some of the other books I read this month, which I was just like turning the pages on. But I could recommend this one as well. All right, next up, I picked up a book called Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King. And this is one of Stephen King's mystery novels. He has obviously a bunch of different genres that he writes in, but this is a longer novel about a man who basically uses his car to kind of plow down a bunch of people, and he kills people in kind of a crowd, and then he taunts the police. And so there's a detective character who's trying to like figure out who this guy is, and then you hear, different alternating chapters from the killer's perspective as well. And so this was a really interesting one. I definitely always enjoy Stephen King when I can pick him up. The next book that I picked up is one called Isola by Allegra Goodman. And this is a book that I believe was on one of the like celebrity book club lists for this month or the last couple of months. It's a relatively new book. And it is based on a true story of a woman who, I believe this is in the 1500s. Let me make sure that this is correct. Let's see. I'm not seeing a direct, oh yes, it is the 1500s. Okay. So basically, there's a woman who's orphaned, and she has this guardian, and he's kind of taking advantage of her wealth and her situation. And he ends up eventually putting her on an island with like her lover. He like catches her with her lover, and he basically like forces them to be on this island, and they have to survive on this island. And I thought that premise was so interesting. It is based on a true story, and also has like a very satisfying ending to it as well. But I'm a sucker for like wilderness narratives, and especially like this one, which has kind of this historical component to it. It was really interesting. The next book I picked up is actually a novella. It is by Frida McFadden, which if you've been watching my last few videos, I've been working my way through her backlist. This one is called Death Row. It's part of a series of multi-author contributors who are contributing a series around alibis. And this particular book is about a woman who's on death row for killing her husband. And then she sees someone in the visiting area who looks like her husband. And so she's thinking maybe she didn't kill him after all, and she's been kind of framed for something. Frida McFadden, if you have never read her, is known for kind of nail-biting suspense, lots of cliffhangery chapters, and this one was no different. So I will continue to read her backlist just because I think they're really fun. They may not be the most well-written books in the world, but they definitely keep you turning the pages. Okay, after that, then I read Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is the latest book by this author. She is beloved. This is the author that wrote Daisy Jones and the Six. She wrote, what is her other really famous one? The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. There's a bunch that she has written that people really enjoy. Very commonly used for book club books. And Atmosphere is the story of two astronauts in like the 1980s. And they're both women, and they have a relationship with each other. And obviously during this time period in NASA, this is not acceptable, and they have to kind of hide their relationship. And I will say that as somebody who's not a big crier with books, the end of this book had me in tears. It was very good, and I think people really have enjoyed the ending of this one in particular, and would definitely recommend this one. Okay, then I picked up a book called The Defense by Steve Kavanaugh. And this is a book that I came across because Steve Kavanaugh has like a series. This is the first book in the series, and like 5 books into the series, he had a book recently come out and it looked really good. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to start at the beginning and work my way to book 5. In this particular book, it is about an attorney who is also a con man. And he gets basically picked up by these mob guys who force him to be the defense attorney for this mobster. And they've kidnapped his daughter. And if he doesn't win the trial, they're going to kill his daughter. And they've already killed like one of his colleagues, basically. This is how they get him to kind of like go with them and figure this out. And this one is so clever. Like there's all these twists and turns that like he's kind of getting himself out of these jams and like trying to figure out what to do. And you feel like he's backed into a corner like all the time. And then all of a sudden he's not, because he like figures a way out of it. I was so drawn into this, and I will continue absolutely reading the series. I immediately put the next book on my library hold list. So I'm really excited to dive into this one more. And I just found like the character development of this particular kind of like lawyer con man to be so fun. All right, then I picked up a couple of nonfiction books. The first one is Trauma and Recovery. This is by Judith Lewis Herman. I have been reading more about trauma and kind of trauma-informed practices around yoga and somatic practices in particular. And this is considered to be kind of a central text in that field and one of the earlier texts in this field. And I will say, similar to a book I recently read, The Body Keeps the Score, I would pair both of those together. I mean, this is basically a text that starts to talk about how people are... people who experience trauma through like war and other like childhood abuse experiences, that they have some common characteristics that can kind of tie them together in terms of how they're treated and in terms of how we can help people overcome trauma over time. And she is kind of one of the early writers talking about that concept. I found this book really interesting. I read it almost back to back. It's very long, but I found it really compelling. And I think that she lays the groundwork for a lot of people who came after her and were writing in this area. Then, as part of my continued reading into neurodivergence, I picked up The Autistic's Guide to Self-Discovery, Flourishing as a Neurodivergent Adult by Saul Smith. One of the things that I really appreciated about this book is the author, who themselves identifies as autistic, goes through a lot of different examples of what neurodivergence can look like across a really broad range of people. So instead of just talking about their own experience, they also talk about like a really broad range of experiences that other people have. So it's not kind of rooted in one person, it's rooted across like a population. So one example of this is he talks about the concept of stimming, which is a form of stimulation that some neurodivergent people do. And sometimes this can include noises or movements or things like that. And this author gave like a huge range of examples of what this can look like. So they didn't just draw from their own experience, but they kind of talked about like all the different kinds of things they've seen over time. And they work, I think, as a coach with like different clients in this space. And so they were able to draw from a lot of different experiences. So that happened across the book, and I thought it was a really valuable resource for that reason. Then I read a book called The Bay at Midnight by Diane Chamberlain. This is an author I've read several things before. This book in particular is basically about a woman who, when she is a younger, I think, teenager, her sister is murdered. And then as an adult, she gets kind of drawn back into this and she's trying to figure out what happened. I would say that while I enjoyed this book, it's not super memorable. It was kind of like a palate cleanser in between other things that I was reading. So I would definitely pick up this author again, but this wasn't like a standout for me for this month. Then I picked up The Family Experiment by John Marrs. This is one of John Marrs' speculative fiction books where he has basically created a world where there's a reality television show where all of these kind of wannabe parents come on and they're given like an AI version of a child that they have to raise in front of an audience. And they get certain challenges, they get the audience like giving them certain things. And if they make it all the way to the end, they get a cash prize and the potential of getting the support, like the fertility support to have a biological child, or they can choose to keep this AI version of their child. This is one of the more clever books, I think, that I've read by John Marrs. All of his books are very clever, but this one in particular, it draws on a lot of like past things he's written about. And when he does speculative fiction, he kind of ties it in with his other speculative fiction as well. And so he'll kind of reference other books lightly that he's written before. This one was really smartly done, and would highly, highly recommend that one. Then I picked up a book called Beg, Borrow, or Steal by Sarah Adams. This is the third book in her series, and it is set in Rome, Kentucky. And there's basically a set of siblings, and they're each having kind of their own romance. And in this particular book, it's basically like an enemies to lovers. There are these two people who live next door to each other. They've known each other for a long time. They don't like each other very much. And then, of course, things turn around and they start to have feelings for each other. This series in Rome, Kentucky is very charming. The first two books are probably my favorite, with the second one slightly edging out the first, but this third book in the series was also quite good. All right, then I picked up a book called Unmasking for Life. This is by Devon Price. Devon Price is a pretty well-known author that writes about neurodivergence, and over time, their pronouns have changed. So in the last book that I talked about with Devon Price, and I'm not even quite remembering the title of that, but I read it several months back, pronouns were they, them. Pronouns are now him and he. And so Devon is someone who does identify as queer, has transitioned, and is talking about basically how do you do something called unmasking when you have autism in particular. So Devon identifies as someone with autism, and one of the concepts of neurodivergence is called masking, which is basically where you are attempting to appear what some people call neurotypical, or what other people might call normal, if you have certain things that you're doing that would call attention to yourself. And what Devon is basically advocating for in this book is that you can unmask, and you can find ways to do that that are maybe comfortable for you, depending on what that looks like in your life and in your work. This, I think, is a really solid contribution to the neurodivergence literature. Devon Price, I think, is talking about some of the more recent phenomenon and kind of what we know about neurodivergence, including the fact that it often overlaps with queer identity. And so it's a very intersectional approach to looking at neurodivergence and autism in particular. Okay, then I picked up a book called This Book Will Bury Me by Ashley Winstead. I was pleasantly surprised by how much I loved this book. It was so fun. So basically, this is a book about a group of people who are like amateur detectives, and they start following a crime of these teenagers, or college students rather, who are killed in Idaho in a house. And it's very similar to the crime that actually happened in Idaho, that there's a court case happening like right now about a man who killed these college students in Idaho. But with this particular storyline, it goes beyond that. So it ends up turning into like the serial killer narrative, which is really interesting. And there's this plot line throughout the entire book of basically like, you know, something has happened because the narrator keeps like referencing that like her reputation is like ruined, and like there's something that has happened later on in the book, and she's like telling the story, and it's leading up to whatever this culminating thing is. I think I read this in like 2 settings. I was completely sucked in. I read it on audio, which was very, very good. And I think that like the amateur kind of like true crime subplot, you know, of some of these mystery books, like it's becoming more and more popular. But this one in particular, there was kind of this like media element that got brought into it that was really interesting. And there's also this like found family element, because the main character kind of hooks in with all these other people, and they're like trying to solve crimes together. Super interesting, super compelling. All right, then I read Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey. This is the first book in a lengthy series that is called The Expanse. And this is one of those series, I was kind of testing it out to see if I would want to continue reading it. And I don't know that I will. It's not that it's not good, I'm just not sure that it's for me. So this is kind of a mystery novel set in space. There is a missing girl, and there is a detective who's basically trying to find her. This, I would say, has a lot of detail, like political intrigue, and I'm trying to figure out how to describe this. Like, I don't know that I can go into a ton of detail without giving things away, but basically, like, if you're interested in mystery set in space, you might give this one a try. It's very long, and each of the books in this series is long. I feel like it has a very particular kind of audience that unfortunately I'm not a part of, but I know other people who've just absolutely loved it, and I do think it's very well written. it had a hard time really capturing my attention. But I also read a lot of books this month that were like very, very plot driven. And I just didn't really feel like this fell into that category. It's more of like this like lengthy space narrative that is clearly setting up a lot of other books in the series. So I don't know that I'm going to continue with this particular one, but I did enjoy it and I would recommend it if that sounds like it's right up your alley. Okay, next up I read The Helsinki Affair by Anna Pitoniak. This is the first book I read by this author, and about halfway through I started looking up her other books to see what else she had written. This is a spy novel, and it's basically about the daughter of a spy who is also a spy. They both work for the CIA, and it was really interesting. I think that I would love if this was a series book. I don't think it is, which is why I started looking up her other books. But it was very satisfying as a spy novel. I think sometimes with spy novels, they can get a little bit plotting, and this one was not that way. I mean, it was very compelling. I listened to it on audio, and the relationship in particular between the daughter and the father is so interesting, especially towards the end of the book. And just kind of seeing how the daughter is like, there's also like some gender things about her being like a female spy and like how that's kind of integrated in the storyline. A lot of really good stuff here. So I can recommend that one as well. Then I picked up The Night and the Moth. This is the latest book by Rachel Gillig, and this is one that a lot of people were very excited about. It's a recent release, and I can see why people really love it. So basically, this is the story about a bunch of, seeing what they're called. They're called diviners, and they're basically people who dream of, and they're kind of like oracles in some way. They dream of things that are going to happen, and people like want to engage them to kind of find out the future. And then these diviners start to go missing, and there's a main one named Sybil who is trying to connect with a knight named Roderick, who is trying to work with her to figure out what happened with these other missing diviners. This is a book that has kind of these like fairy tale elements to it, which, if you have heard me talk about this in the past, it's not necessarily my cup of tea. That said, it's beautifully written. I can totally understand why there are certain people who are just completely obsessed with this book, who completely love it. It's not like 100% in my, wheelhouse in terms of the kinds of things that I enjoy. But if any of that sounds interesting to you and this is your kind of book, I can definitely recommend to pick it up. All right, next I picked up another couple of nonfiction books. The first is How to Be Enough by Ellen Hendrickson. This is a book that I had seen kind of floating around and a lot of people talking about. It's basically a book about self-acceptance and how to be less like self-critical, and also how to like not procrastinate on things. Like there's a number of like self-helpy components of this book that I found really interesting. The thing that I always appreciate about books like this is having a wide range of examples and a wide range of approaches and kind of tips and tricks and strategies that people can try. And this book definitely falls into this category, so can recommend that one as well. Then I read The Mountain Is You, Transforming Self-Sabotage into Self-Mastery by Brianna Wiest. This is a book, again, that I had seen like floating around. It's been out for a while. I finally was able to pick up a copy. And this particular book, I would say, some people might say it's just a bunch of kind of like platitudes that are strung together, but I actually found it to be quite powerful. I think that it's one of those books that you might want to get like a hard copy and kind of like underline and return to and kind of journal about and make notes with. I did listen to it on audio, and I could definitely see eventually like picking up a hard copy of this one and doing a little bit of like annotation with it. All right, next I picked up The Maid by Nita Prose, and what a delight this book was. Somebody reached out to me after they watched the TBR video from this past month, and they knew I was going to be reading this book, and they said how much I would enjoy it, and they were absolutely right. I really loved the main character of this book. So basically, you have a maid who's working in a hotel, and she gets embroiled in this situation where she doesn't fully understand what's going on, and it's never quite explained what it is that causes her to not understand. Like, she may be a little bit autistic, she may have some kind of like mental deficiency, like there's something there where she's not able to kind of like read the situation around her in the way that other people can kind of read between the lines and understand what's going on. And so basically, because of all of this, she gets accused of murder, and she's like has no idea what to do. And these like wonderful like friends and found family come around her and kind of help her through this situation. This is the first in a series. I ended up later in the month picking up a novella, which is actually Christmas themed, called The Mistletoe Mystery, that is like a novella with the same characters in the series, just because it was available in my library. And I enjoyed reading that one as well. So it was really fun to be exposed to this character and to try out this new series. All right, so then I went on a bit of a tear reading a couple of novellas and a novel that are tied to the Heartstopper series by Alice Oseman. And this is a series that I was originally exposed to as a set of graphic novels. And then I found out she actually wrote a novel about one of the characters in the series. And then she's also written these other kind of like short novellas about continuing the story of these two main characters. So Heartstopper, which was made into a Netflix series, is about two boys who one of them is out and gay, the other one is not, and they basically fall for each other. And so it is the story of the coming out of the boy who is not openly gay and how they develop this relationship over time and how they're navigating a number of things, including like some mental health issues and their kind of family relationships and things like that. In this particular series, there is a sister of the one of the boys, and she has a novel, and that novel is called Solitaire. And this is kind of her story, and she's kind of, I believe she's an older sister, and so it's like her story of being in school and like her friendship circle. And then there are a couple other books in this series, This Winter, which is like a Christmas novella, and then a book called Nick and Charlie, which is basically about the transition of Nick into college, and Charlie is still remaining back in kind of like the high school equivalent there in the UK. So I read basically the three of those back to back. I had them available on audio from my library, and I have been binge watching the Heartstopper series on Netflix as well. It is one of the best adaptations I have ever seen, and it has the vibes of the graphic novels, and it's so incredible. I can recommend any of the things in this series if you're interested in kind of following along with just a really beautiful and warm, kind of love story between these two boys. All right, then I picked up Such Quiet Girls by Noelle Ely. This is a book that is based off of a true story and is basically about the kidnapping of a bunch of young children, and they are buried underground and have to be found. And this was actually something that did happen, and the author was kind of basing this off of the story. So it's about these young kids, the caretaker who's like driving a bus with them when they get kidnapped, and then the kidnappers, and then like there's another character who's kind of it's multiple point of view. There's another character who's the parent of a couple of the kids who've been kidnapped. While I thought this hung together really well, I did find it to be like not as engaging, and I wonder if part of that was because I knew that it was based on a true story, and so it just felt like it wasn't as, I don't know, creative in that sense, because it was kind of based on the stuff that I already knew happened. And I enjoyed the multiple point of view, component of this particular book. I just found that like it wasn't the book that I was like excited to go back to, which I'm sorry to say, because I know some other people who've really enjoyed it. So if it sounds interesting to you, you might pick that one up. Next up, I picked up a book called Continuous Creation. This is a book of poetry, actually the last book of poetry that was published by a man named Les Murray. I found out about Les Murray from a book that I read either last month or the month before that was about different people on the autism spectrum. And one of the people that was mentioned in this book, not the person who was interviewed, but he was kind of like a inspiration to somebody else in the book, is Les Murray, who is considered to be maybe one of the first autistic poets that we are aware of. And so I thought, okay, like how famous is this guy? Because he's from Australia, had never heard of him. And my library had a couple of his books. So I picked up one of them. I would say he's primarily, at least based on this book, a nature poet. And he's focusing on, kind of the natural environment. I don't know that this is like the best book of his collection because it was like literally what they found that he was working on like when he died. But I thought it was an interesting kind of introduction to his work, and glad that I picked that one up. All right, then I picked up a book called One Mission by Chris Fussell. This is a leadership book that is based on the author's experience in the military. I will say, while I find these books to be helpful, I'm probably not the core audience for these books. And I find that leadership books that are based on military experience, at least for me, require like a decent amount of translation, just because that's not part of my background. And it is just a very different world and culture than what I experience when I'm working in higher education. So I think there's a very specific audience for this particular book, and I probably was not in that audience. Took away a couple of things, but still had to do quite a bit of translation to make sure it was like effective for my context. All right, next up I read Better Than the Movies by Lynn Painter. This is a YA romance about two next door neighbors, a girl and a boy, who basically hate each other throughout their childhoods. And then they have a change of feeling as they become teenagers. And basically the girl is interested in this other boy, and she asks the neighbor to like help her be connected to this friend of his, basically. And they decide that they're gonna like partner up to help her be noticed by this guy. And there's a lot of references to rom-coms throughout this book. It is definitely meant to be kind of like based off of like some of the teenage rom-coms of like the 90s. And it does have a second book in the series, which I will probably pick up because I found this one to be very charming, and I really enjoyed all the rom-com references as well. All right, next up, I read Tell Me What You Did. This is by Carter Wilson. And this is a book about a true crime podcaster who brings people on their show and they admit to committing crimes. And she kind of has them confess on the show. And she has some rules about what they can admit to and what they can't. But this person comes on the show and says, basically, I killed your mother because she is the daughter of a murder victim. And she knows that that can't be true because she actually killed the killer of her mother when she was younger. And so things move on from there. And of course, a lot of things become revealed throughout this particular storyline. I did think that this was like a pretty compelling premise, and it kept my attention, throughout the book. I would pick up another book by this author. I think this was the first one that I read by them. Okay, just a few more. Then I picked up Shield of Sparrows by Devney Perry. And Devney Perry is most known for probably romance suspense. This is her first foray into romantasy, and people are loving it. And it's a New York Times bestseller. And I was like, okay, I want to pick this up before I get spoilers of like what this is about. And there are so many fun fantasy tropes that are brought into this particular book. I will say I feel like you can kind of tell this is her first one. I don't think it's poorly done. I just think that it's not what she's known for. It's not the thing that she's been writing for years and years and years. I think it has a Fourth Wing quality to it. Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros was another like very famous romantasy that came out several years ago. And one of the things that I think people probably appreciate the most about this book is it's incredibly easy to get into the world building. And there is a little bit of a twist that I did see coming and I did predict, but I think this is a pretty solid entry, and I know it's going to be the first in a series for her. We'll definitely pick up the next book in the series when it comes out. All right, then I picked up at a recommendation of somebody who watches this channel. Somebody reached out and said they thought I would like The Lions of Fifth Avenue by Fiona Davis. This is a historical fiction novel that is set in a library where a crime has taken place, and it goes back and forth between kind of the early days of this crime and present day, or the 90s, where there are manuscripts that are being stolen from this library. This book was incredibly charming. And of course, I looked up the author's other books and found out that basically this person writes about historical situations that are set around particular buildings that are kind of like famous buildings. And because of that, they do like a bunch of research into that building, and then they kind of bring it into the storyline of what they're trying to create in the story. And I thought that was such a cool thing to do. So I really like this one. If you like historical fiction, if you like libraries, would definitely pick that one up. And then the last book that I read in June 2025 is called A Tribute of Fire by Soraya Wilson. This is a book that is the first in a series, and I will say that it had it's lengthy. I want to say that there were kind of like 4 or 5 different like blocks that you could kind of understand of what was going on. Like there was kind of this phase in the early part of the book, and then you kind of shift into this like other geographic area in like a situation, and then you shift into like this other situation in this other geographic area. Like, so there were kind of 4 or 5 like big chunks that were happening throughout this book. And there was something about it, like I think that it felt a little bit disconnected to me in terms of like how all of these things were getting strung together, and there was a lot happening. I think the thing I guess I would say is like I think it needed a slightly more heavy editorial hand because it felt very long. And maybe it should have been 2 books, like instead of just the big long one. I don't know. But the way that it was kind of all coming together, it felt like there was just a lot there. And I could follow it, but it was kind of like I was having a hard time like keeping my attention with it because of just like how the pieces were coming together. So generally what this is about, if you're kind of interested in the general plot, is there is a princess who gets put into this like competition with her sister, and they have to survive the competition. And I thought that was what the book was about, because that's basically what's in the description. And it turns out that's like the first of the blocks that I was mentioning. Like that's like the thing that happens in the first block. And then you transition into this like totally different storyline because of what happens related to the competition, which I don't want to give away. And so there was this whole other like 80%, of the book that wasn't focused on like what is in the book's description. So maybe part of this is like the book's description kind of led me astray a little bit. And so I wasn't quite sure what to expect. But all that said, I mean, it's a solid fantasy novel. I'm just not sure I'm going to be kind of compelled enough to pick up the next book in the series. So based on all of that, there were a ton of really, really good books, a lot of recent books, a lot of like familiar authors that I picked up this past month. And it was such a good reading month. I hope you'll stick around and check out my TBR video for July, where I have a ton of other good books I'm hoping to get to. And until then, happy reading.